Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most haunting nights in ancient history. A story Hollywood turned into legend, but never fully told. In the darkness of a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a Spartan king named Leonidas stood with only 300 warriors against the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. But this isn't the loud, heroic version you might remember from movies. Tonight, we slow everything down. We'll walk through the quiet tension before the battle, the brutal 3 days where bronze shields crashed like thunder in a narrow corridor of rock, the betrayal that sealed their fate, and the revenge that history almost forgot. Because the truth about Leonidas is far stranger and far more powerful than the myth. His story isn't only about war. It's about discipline, sacrifice, and the fragile moment when a handful of people decide to stand still while the rest of the world moves around them. So if you enjoy history for sleep, bedtime stories from the ancient world, and relaxing journeys through real events that shaped civilization, you're in exactly the right place tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and imagine the sound of distant waves touching the shore below the cliffs of Thermopylae, the quiet wind moving through the mountains, and somewhere in the darkness, 300 Spartan shields waiting in silence for an empire to arrive. Now that the fire has settled into a gentle rhythm and the night has grown quiet around you, let us begin to walk slowly into the world where Leonidas first opened his eyes. Imagine a valley in southern Greece long before the marble temples of Athens became famous, long before philosophers debated the meaning of life beneath olive trees. This place was called Sparta, a city hidden within the fertile valley of the Eurotas River in the region of Laconia, surrounded by rugged mountains that seemed almost designed by nature to isolate it from the rest of ancient Greece. To travelers approaching from afar, Sparta might have appeared strangely unimpressive. There were no towering walls, no glittering monuments, no grand theaters where poets performed tragedies. And yet the people of Sparta were proud of that absence. They would calmly explain that their walls were unnecessary because the true walls of Sparta were the Spartan warriors themselves, men who stood shield to shield in bronze armor, trained from childhood to defend their homeland with a discipline that few other societies in the ancient world could match. While Athens pursued art, philosophy, and democratic debate, Sparta built something entirely different. Sparta built soldiers. But to understand why Sparta became such a severe and uncompromising society, we must look further back into its darker history, to a time when the Spartans fought a war that would change the fate of their city forever. Around the 8th century before Christ, Sparta conquered its neighboring land of Messenia after a brutal and prolonged conflict. Instead of simply claiming territory, the Spartans enslaved the entire population. These conquered people became known as helots, agricultural laborers forced to work the land and provide food for their Spartan masters. Over time, the number of helots grew to be astonishingly large, perhaps 7 times greater than the number of full Spartan citizens. Imagine living in a city where for every Spartan warrior, there were 7 people who had every reason to hate you. 7 people who might one day rise up in rebellion if they sensed weakness. That quiet, constant fear shaped everything about Spartan society. It shaped how they governed, how they lived, and most importantly, how they raised their children. In most places in ancient Greece, childhood was a protected and gradual stage of life. But in Sparta, childhood was treated as the beginning of military service. Spartan boys were not simply expected to grow into warriors, they were molded into them from the very moment they were born. The state believed that survival itself depended on creating men who were fearless, obedient, and capable of enduring suffering without complaint. And so, the Spartan way of life became famous, or perhaps infamous, throughout the ancient world for its severity. Travelers from other Greek cities often described Sparta with a mixture of admiration and horror. They marveled at the discipline of Spartan warriors and the unity of their society. Yet they also whispered about the harsh customs that shaped those warriors from childhood. Because in Sparta, strength was not optional. It was the foundation of the entire state. Every Spartan citizen was expected to dedicate his life to warfare, to training, and to the defense of the city. Wealth meant little, comfort meant even less. What mattered was endurance, loyalty, and courage in battle. This culture created some of the most feared soldiers in ancient Greece, men whose reputations spread across the Mediterranean world. But that reputation came at a cost, and the cost was paid first by the youngest members of Spartan society, the children, because the Spartans believed that if their warriors were to remain strong enough to control the vast Helot population, they had to begin shaping those warriors almost before they could speak. And the methods they used to do so were unlike anything most people today could imagine. In fact, when modern historians describe the early training of Spartan boys, many readers are left stunned by how extreme those practices were. The stories that survive from ancient sources paint a picture that feels almost unreal, a system where tenderness was replaced with discipline and comfort was replaced with hardship. It was a world where a child's life was not guided primarily by family, but by the needs of the state. And somewhere within that severe and unyielding system, a boy named Leonidas would grow up. At the time of his birth, there was nothing about him that suggested he would one day become the most famous Spartan king in history. He was not the first son. He was not the heir to the throne. In fact, he was the third son in a royal family that already had clear lines of succession. To most people around him, he was simply another Spartan boy, destined to follow the same harsh path as every other child in the city. But history has a quiet and mysterious way of reshaping the lives of ordinary children. And sometimes, the boys who seem least destined for greatness are the ones who emerge from the shadows of history, carrying the heaviest burdens. Because in Sparta, before a boy could become a warrior, before he could carry a shield into battle, he first had to survive something far more difficult. He had to survive childhood. And what the Spartans did to their children would make even the toughest modern parents shudder. And so, in a city where strength meant survival and discipline meant stability, the lives of Spartan boys began to follow a path unlike anything seen in the rest of ancient Greece. In most cities, children grew up within the warmth of their households, guided by parents and surrounded by stories, music, and the small comforts of daily life. But in Sparta, childhood slowly slipped away long before a boy understood what it meant to be safe. Because when a Spartan boy reached the age of 7, something extraordinary happened. He stopped belonging to his family. From that moment forward, he belonged to the state. This system was known as the agoge, the legendary training program that transformed ordinary boys into the feared Spartan warriors whose reputation echoed across the ancient world. To outsiders, the agoge sounded almost unbelievable. Yet to the Spartans, it was simply the natural way things had always been done. On the day a boy entered the agoge, he left the home where he had slept beside his mother's hearth, perhaps for the last time in many years. The boys were gathered together into groups, watched over by older youths who had already survived several stages of the training. These older boys were not gentle teachers, they were harsh mentors who enforced discipline with strict authority, because the Spartans believed that leadership must be learned through hardship rather than comfort. The young trainees were given only the most basic necessities. Each year they received a single cloak to wear through every season. Winter winds, cold rain, and the burning sun of the Peloponnesian summer were all endured beneath that same piece of rough cloth. Shoes were not provided. The boys walked barefoot across rocky ground, their feet gradually hardening as they adapted to the unforgiving landscape of ancient Sparta. Beds were considered unnecessary luxuries. Instead, the boys slept on bundles of reeds they gathered themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River. Even food, one of the basic needs of life, was intentionally limited. Spartan instructors believed hunger sharpened both the body and the mind. The boys were encouraged to steal food whenever they could. But here lay the cruel lesson hidden within the practice. If a boy was caught stealing, he was beaten severely. Not for stealing, the punishment came because he had failed to steal well enough to avoid detection. In this way, the agoge trained cunning as much as courage. It created young men who were not only strong, but alert, resourceful, and capable of surviving under constant pressure. Imagine growing up in such an environment where every day tested your endurance and every mistake carried consequences. Yet within that harsh world, deep bonds formed among the boys. They trained together, suffered together, and slowly came to see one another as brothers in arms. Spartan society believed loyalty to one's fellow warriors was stronger than loyalty to family. A soldier who trusted the man beside him on the battlefield would fight with greater courage than one who fought alone. And somewhere among those groups of barefoot boys learning to endure hunger and cold was Leonidas. At the time, no one saw him as extraordinary. He was not treated differently from the others. Being the third son of a royal family meant he was unlikely to inherit the throne. His older brother Cleomenes was the future king, and expectations placed upon Leonidas were no different than those placed upon any other Spartan boy. He trained, endured, struggled, and adapted just like the rest. Yet perhaps it was precisely this ordinary upbringing that shaped him. Unlike princes raised in luxury elsewhere in the ancient world, Leonidas grew up sharing the same hardships as every Spartan warrior he would one day command. He knew the cold ground beneath his back. He knew the taste of hunger during long training days. He knew what it meant to endure pain without complaint. These experiences quietly forged something within him long before history would ever record his name. And as the years passed, the boys of the agoge slowly became young men. Their bodies grew stronger, their movements more disciplined, their minds sharper. By the time they approached adulthood, they had already spent more than a decade learning the art of endurance, obedience, and survival. But even after surviving the agoge, the final lessons of Spartan training were not taught within the safety of barracks or training fields. They were taught in the darkness beyond the city, where the young warriors would face a test that blurred the line between survival and something far more unsettling. By the time a Spartan youth approached the age of 18, he had already endured more hardship than most men in ancient Greece would experience in an entire lifetime. Years of Spartan training within the agoge had hardened his body, sharpened his instincts, and taught him how to obey without hesitation. Yet the Spartan system believed that even this was not enough. True warriors, they insisted, must face a final test that could not be taught within the boundaries of a training ground, because war itself was unpredictable, silent, and often merciless. And so, as the fire beside you crackles softly in the quiet of the night, imagine a young Spartan standing at the edge of the city, no longer a child, but not yet fully a man. Before him stretches the countryside of Laconia, the same rolling fields and shadowed hills where the Helots worked from sunrise until dusk. Somewhere out there, hidden within the darkness of ancient Sparta, waited the most unsettling stage of Spartan education. This stage was known as the Crypteia. To modern historians, the Crypteia remains one of the most mysterious institutions of Spartan society. Ancient writers such as Plutarch described it as a secretive organization made up of the strongest and most promising young Spartan warriors. These youths were selected carefully, not only for their strength, but for their endurance, discipline, and ability to move unseen. Once chosen, they were sent out into the countryside with almost nothing: no heavy armor, no shield, often not even sandals. The young men carried little more than a cloak and a knife. Their task was simple in description, but chilling in practice. They were expected to survive alone. By day, they hid among fields, hills, and forests, avoiding detection. By night, they moved silently across the land. Their purpose was not merely survival, it was control. Sparta lived in constant tension with the massive Helot population that surrounded the city. The Helots farmed the land and produced the food that sustained Spartan society, but they also represented a permanent threat. The Spartans feared rebellion above all else. If the Helots ever rose together, they could overwhelm the small population of Spartan citizens. The Crypteia served as a grim solution to this problem. Each year, according to some ancient accounts, the Spartan authorities would symbolically declare war on the Helots. This declaration allowed young members of the Crypteia to kill Helots without committing religious pollution, an important concern in ancient Greek belief. Moving through the countryside at night, these young warriors watched carefully. Any Helot found wandering after dark could become a target. Strong individuals who appeared capable of leading resistance were particularly vulnerable. To modern readers, this practice feels deeply unsettling, even brutal. Yet within the logic of ancient Sparta, it served two purposes simultaneously. It kept the Helot population living in fear, discouraging organized rebellion, and it forced young Spartan warriors to confront the harsh realities of violence and survival long before they entered the battlefield. For the Spartans, war was not an occasional event, it was the foundation of their entire society. And the Crypteia ensured that the next generation of Spartan warriors would be prepared for the ruthless world they were expected to defend. Now, historians cannot say with certainty whether Leonidas himself participated directly in the Crypteia. The surviving sources remain unclear. But Leonidas grew up within the same system, surrounded by the same traditions and shaped by the same expectations placed upon every Spartan male citizen. Whether he walked the countryside as part of the Crypteia or simply lived within a society that accepted its existence, the lesson remained the same. Violence in Sparta was not chaos, it was structure, it was policy. It was woven deeply into the identity of the city itself. And as the young men of Sparta emerged from this final stage of training, they did so transformed. No longer boys, not merely soldiers, but disciplined warriors whose loyalty to Sparta was stronger than fear, stronger than comfort, and often even stronger than life itself. Among those warriors stood Leonidas, now a grown man who had survived the same relentless system that forged every Spartan defender.
At the time, few could have imagined how important his life would soon become to the fate of ancient Greece, because far beyond the mountains of Laconia, another power was rising, an empire vast enough to swallow entire civilizations, and before long, that empire would begin moving westward toward the small but unyielding world of Sparta.
And so, after years shaped by the harsh discipline of ancient Sparta, Leonidas stepped quietly into adulthood, not as a legendary figure, not yet as a king, but simply as another Spartan warrior who had survived the unforgiving path laid before every boy of the city. In many ways, his life appeared predictable. Sparta was ruled by a unique system that puzzled many outsiders in ancient Greece. Instead of one royal family, Sparta had two kings ruling at the same time, each from a different royal line. One of these lines was known as the Agiad dynasty, said by tradition to trace its ancestry back to the hero Heracles himself. Leonidas was born into this Agiad line, but fate did not place him first in line for the throne. His older brother Cleomenes was the king, a powerful figure who ruled Sparta during a period of growing tension across the Greek world. Cleomenes was known as an ambitious and unpredictable leader, capable of brilliant strategy, but also prone to behavior that puzzled even his allies. Ancient historians recorded strange stories about his later years. Some claimed that he had slowly descended into madness. Others suggested political enemies may have exaggerated his instability. Whatever the truth, Cleomenes' final days were tragic and unsettling. According to the historian Herodotus, the king died in a disturbing manner, purportedly cutting himself repeatedly with a blade while imprisoned. Whether this account was literal truth or shaped by political rumor, it left Sparta without a stable ruler. But Leonidas was still not the obvious successor. Before him stood another brother, Dorius, a proud and ambitious Spartan prince who had once attempted to establish colonies far from home. Dorius believed he deserved the throne and had little patience for Sparta's complicated traditions. Yet history rarely unfolds according to human expectations. During one of his distant expeditions, Dorius died in battle in Sicily, far from the mountains and valleys of his homeland. And so, one by one, the paths ahead of Leonidas slowly cleared, though no one could have predicted such an outcome when he was a boy enduring the cold nights of the Agoge. By the time Leonidas reached around 40 years of age, the unexpected had happened. The third son, once overlooked and unremarkable, had become the next Spartan king. Yet Leonidas did not rule like many monarchs of the ancient world. In Sparta, even a king remained a soldier first. He ate with other warriors in communal mess halls. He lived within the same disciplined system that governed every Spartan citizen. Authority in Sparta was shared with powerful councils, such as the Gerousia, a body of elders whose wisdom shaped major decisions of the state. Leonidas therefore ruled not as an isolated ruler, but as the foremost warrior within a society built entirely around warfare and discipline. Around this time, Leonidas also married Gorgo, the daughter of his brother Cleomenes. In many ancient societies, royal women remained silent figures in the background of political life. But Gorgo appears in historical sources as a woman of unusual intelligence and sharp insight. Herodotus recounts moments when she offered clever advice in political matters, suggesting that the royal household of Sparta was not entirely silent when decisions were made. Together, Leonidas and Gorgo represented a partnership that reflected the strength and clarity valued by Spartan culture. Yet despite his new role as king, Leonidas's early years on the throne were relatively quiet. Sparta remained powerful but cautious. The Greek world itself was a patchwork of rival city-states, each proud, each independent, and often suspicious of one another.
few people in Greece yet realized that a storm was forming far beyond the eastern horizon. Because while the Spartans trained their warriors and governed their disciplined society, another empire was expanding with astonishing speed. To the east, across the vast lands of Asia, the Persian Empire had become the most powerful state the world had ever seen. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its kings commanded territories stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. And soon, the ambitions of that empire would reach the shores of Greece. The quiet years of Leonidas's early reign would not last forever, because history was slowly guiding him toward a moment that would test everything Sparta believed about courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. A moment that would one day echo across thousands of years of human memory. So take a slow breath now. Let the warmth of the fire settle once more into the quiet of the night, because the boy who survived Sparta's harsh childhood is now become King Leonidas. And in the next chapter of our story, the greatest empire on earth will begin moving toward Greece, and the Spartan king will face a decision that the world will never forget.
Now imagine for a moment that the quiet valley of Sparta fades away, and the warmth of the fire beside you gives way to the distant sound of waves rolling gently against the rocky shores of Greece. You are standing along the coastline, somewhere far to the east, watching the horizon where sea and sky meet in the dim light of early morning. At first, there is only the calm surface of the water stretching endlessly into the distance. But slowly, shapes begin to appear. One ship, then another, and another. Soon the horizon is no longer blue, but crowded with dark silhouettes of sails. Hundreds of them, then thousands, so many that the sea itself seems to disappear behind their shadows. This is the fleet of Xerxes, king of the Persian Empire, and it is moving steadily toward Greece. To understand why this enormous invasion is happening, we must step back in time about 10 years before the famous Battle of Thermopylae. The story begins not with Xerxes, but with his father, Darius the Great, ruler of the vast Persian Empire. At that time, the Persian Empire was the largest political power the world had ever known. Its territory stretched across continents, from the fertile lands of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Egypt, and from the mountains of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Yet even empires of unimaginable size sometimes carry wounds that refuse to heal. In the western edge of the empire, along the coast of Asia Minor, several Greek cities had once lived under Persian rule. These cities belonged to a region known as Ionia. Around 499 BC, the Ionian Greeks rebelled against Persian authority. Their revolt might have faded quickly if not for one important decision made far across the Aegean Sea. The city of Athens chose to help them. A small fleet of Athenian ships crossed the sea and joined the rebellion. For the Athenians, it may have seemed like a minor intervention, a gesture of support for fellow Greeks. But for Darius, king of the Persian Empire, it was something else entirely. It was an insult. According to the historian Herodotus, Darius was so angered by the involvement of Athens that he ordered a servant to remind him every day during dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." The words were repeated again and again until revenge became part of the king's daily thoughts. Eventually, Darius sent a massive expedition across the sea to punish the Greek cities responsible. In 490 BC, Persian ships landed on the plain of Marathon, not far from Athens itself. The Persian army likely numbered around 25,000 men, experienced soldiers drawn from across the empire. They expected an easy victory against the smaller Greek forces defending the region. Yet history sometimes turns on moments that no one expects. The Athenians, joined by a small contingent from the city of Plataea, marched out to meet the invaders.
In one of the most remarkable battles of ancient warfare, roughly 10,000 Greek hoplites charged across the plain and shattered the Persian army. The Battle of Marathon became legendary almost immediately. It proved that the mighty Persian Empire could be resisted. It also left the Persian king humiliated. Darius began planning another invasion, one that would be larger, stronger, and more carefully organized. But fate intervened. Before he could carry out his revenge, Darius died, leaving the unfinished war to his son. That son was Xerxes. Xerxes inherited not only the throne of the Persian Empire, but also the memory of Marathon. For a young king ruling the most powerful empire on earth, the defeat of his father was more than a political setback. It was a challenge to imperial authority itself. If a small collection of Greek city-states could defeat Persia once, other regions might believe rebellion was possible as well. And so Xerxes began preparing for a campaign unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. For 4 long years, the empire gathered resources, built ships, trained soldiers, and organized supply routes that stretched across continents. Xerxes even ordered a canal carved through the narrow peninsula of Mount Athos so his fleet could avoid the dangerous waters where Persian ships had once been lost in a storm. It was an astonishing engineering project, a clear sign of the scale at which the Persian Empire could operate. But the most famous moment of Xerxes' preparations came at the narrow strait known as the Hellespont. To move his army from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered engineers to construct enormous floating bridges across the water. When the first bridges were destroyed by a violent storm, the king reportedly reacted with dramatic fury. Ancient writers claim he ordered the sea itself to be punished with 300 lashes of a whip, as if the natural world had dared to defy the will of the Persian Empire. Whether this story is entirely true or partly symbolic, it captures something essential about Xerxes' ambition. He was not merely planning a military expedition. He was preparing to bring the full weight of the Persian Empire crashing down upon Greece.
And so, as Xerxes prepared his vast invasion, the scale of what he was building slowly began to spread through rumors, whispers, and fearful stories across the ancient world. Greek merchants sailing across the Aegean carried the news first. Travelers arriving from Asia told stories that sounded almost impossible to believe. They spoke of roads filled with soldiers for miles at a time, of endless columns of men marching beneath banners from distant lands, and of ships so numerous that entire harbors disappeared behind forests of masts. These stories eventually reached the ears of the Greek historian Herodotus, the man who would later record the great conflict between Greece and the Persian Empire. Herodotus attempted to describe the size of Xerxes' army, but even he seemed overwhelmed by what he had heard. According to his account, the Persian invasion force numbered more than 2.5 million soldiers. If that number were true, it would have been an army larger than the population of many entire nations of the ancient world. Modern historians, studying logistics and geography more carefully, believe that Herodotus likely exaggerated the numbers. Moving and feeding millions of soldiers across ancient terrain would have been nearly impossible, yet even the most cautious estimates remain astonishing. Many scholars suggest that Xerxes may have commanded somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, still making it the largest army ever assembled in the ancient Mediterranean world. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this army was not simply its size, but its diversity. The Persian Empire stretched across dozens of cultures, languages, and landscapes, and the army of Xerxes reflected that extraordinary reach. Imagine standing beside the long road where the army passed and watching the endless variety of soldiers marching by. Some wore scale armor made of overlapping metal plates that shimmered in the sunlight. Others carried tall wicker shields and curved bows crafted from horn and wood.
Some marched on foot, while others rode swift horses across the dusty plains. The Persians themselves formed the heart of the army, disciplined infantry who had grown up under the traditions of imperial warfare. Among them marched the most famous unit of all, the Immortals. This elite guard consisted of 10,000 soldiers who served as the personal protectors of the Persian king. Their name came from a curious practice. Whenever one of the Immortals died or was wounded, another soldier immediately took his place, ensuring the unit always remained exactly 10,000 strong. To observers, it seemed as if their numbers never diminished, as if they were truly immortal warriors. Alongside them rode cavalry from Media, warriors known for their skill with horses and their ability to strike quickly across open ground. From the eastern regions of Bactria came archers who could fire arrows with remarkable speed and precision. From the lands near the Nile arrived Egyptian troops, some carrying long spears and riding chariots designed for speed and shock in battle. And from even farther lands came tribes whose languages and customs were barely known to the Greeks, who would soon face them in war. When all these forces gathered under the command of Xerxes, the result was something the ancient world had rarely seen before. This was not merely the army of a single nation, it was an empire in motion, entire cultures marching together beneath the authority of one king. The logistical challenge of feeding and moving such a massive force was extraordinary. Supply caravans followed the army across mountains and rivers. Ships sailed along the coastline carrying grain, water, and equipment to support the advancing soldiers. Ancient writers even recorded stories that when the Persian army stopped beside a river to drink, the water level visibly dropped. Whether such stories were literal truth or poetic exaggeration, they reflected the overwhelming impression the army left on those who saw it. For the Greek city-states watching these events unfold, the realization was terrifying. This was not a raid or a limited campaign. This was a tidal wave of soldiers moving steadily toward their homeland. And as the news spread across the mountains and valleys of Greece, city after city was forced to confront the same difficult question. Should they resist the greatest empire on earth, or submit before the storm arrived?
So word of Xerxes' enormous army spread slowly across the mountains and valleys of Greece. A quiet tension settled over the entire region. Messengers traveled dusty roads carrying urgent news from city to city. Sailors arriving at busy ports repeated the same unsettling stories of Persian ships filling the horizon. Farmers working the hills of Attica and the plains of Thessaly began to hear whispers of a force so large that even the strongest cities might not be able to resist it. And gradually, a difficult realization began to take shape among the Greek city-states. If they faced this invasion alone, they would almost certainly fall. Yet unity did not come easily to the Greek world. Greece was not a single country, it was a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states, each proud of its own traditions, its own laws, and its own rivalries. Athens and Sparta were the most famous among them, but dozens of other cities held their own ambitions and suspicions. Many had fought wars against one another for generations. Old grudges rarely faded quickly in the ancient world. And so when the leaders of Greece gathered to discuss the coming Persian invasion, they did so not as trusted allies, but as cautious rivals forced together by necessity. The meeting took place at the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow strip of land connecting southern Greece to the mainland. Strategically, it was a natural gathering point, and for centuries it had been a crossroads of trade, travel, and political negotiation. Here, representatives from various Greek city-states assembled in what historians sometimes call the Isthmus Council. Yet the atmosphere of the meeting was far from confident or heroic. Fear hung quietly over the discussions.
Some cities believed resistance against the Persian Empire was hopeless. Others wondered whether surrender might preserve their independence better than war. In fact, as historians now understand, a surprising number of Greek city-states chose submission rather than resistance. They sent envoys to Xerxes bearing symbolic gifts known as earth and water, a traditional Persian ritual signifying surrender and acceptance of Persian authority. Cities such as Thebes, Argos, and Thessaly either openly supported Persia or quietly withdrew from the idea of resistance. For many of them, survival seemed more important than pride. Modern audiences often imagine the Greeks standing united against a foreign empire, but the reality was far more complicated. Only around 30 city-states ultimately agreed to oppose Xerxes. Among them were Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and several smaller allies who believed if Greece surrendered without a fight, their freedom might vanish forever. Yet even among those who chose resistance, agreement was not easy. Athens, a powerful naval city, believed the key to defeating Persia lay at sea. The Athenians had been strengthening their fleet for years under the guidance of the statesman Themistocles. He argued that Persian supply lines could be disrupted by naval warfare, forcing Xerxes' massive army into logistical difficulty. Sparta, however, viewed the situation differently. As the dominant land power in Greece, Sparta believed the invasion should be stopped on solid ground, where heavily armored hoplite warriors could fight in tight formation. Spartan military tradition valued discipline, patience, and defensive positioning. Their leaders proposed building defenses at the isthmus itself, effectively abandoning northern Greece but protecting the Peloponnese, where Sparta and several key allies were located. This strategy was practical but controversial. Cities in central Greece, particularly those closer to the approaching Persian army, were understandably uneasy with the idea of being sacrificed for the safety of the south. And so the debate continued, sometimes tense, sometimes uncertain. The Greeks were not deciding between easy choices. They were choosing between different risks, each with potentially devastating consequences. It was during these discussions that a remarkable idea emerged, an idea that would eventually lead to one of the most famous battles in human history. Instead of defending the isthmus far to the south, some leaders proposed confronting the Persians earlier at a narrow mountain pass in central Greece known as Thermopylae. The name meant hot gates, a reference to the natural hot springs that bubbled nearby. More importantly, the geography of Thermopylae offered something extremely valuable to a smaller defending force. The pass was incredibly narrow, squeezed between steep mountains and the sea. In some places, the road was barely wide enough for a single chariot to pass. A massive army could not spread out easily there. Numbers, the greatest advantage of Xerxes' army, would suddenly become far less effective. If the Greeks could hold that narrow passage, even a small force might delay the Persian advance long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. It was a bold plan, but it would require a leader willing to stand at the gateway of Greece itself and face the approaching empire.
And so, as the council slowly reached its uneasy conclusion, attention turned toward a place that few people outside central Greece had ever considered important before. It was not a great city, not a fortified capital, and not a place where kings usually chose to make history. It was simply a narrow passage of land, pressed between mountain cliffs and the restless waters of the Malian Gulf. The Greeks called it Thermopylae, which meant the hot gates, named for the steaming natural springs that bubbled quietly along the rocky ground. At first glance, the location seemed unremarkable. Yet for those who understood the realities of ancient warfare, Thermopylae offered something priceless. Geography itself could become a weapon. In the early 5th century before Christ, the pass at Thermopylae was far narrower than it appears today. In some places, the road between mountain and sea was barely wide enough for a single chariot to pass through. For a massive army like the one Xerxes was leading, this narrow corridor would force thousands of soldiers into a compressed formation. Their numbers, which had seemed so terrifying in open terrain, would become far less effective when they could only advance a few ranks at a time. A disciplined defensive force could hold such a passage far longer than anyone might expect. It was a strategic opportunity that the Greek alliance could not ignore. Yet the plan also carried a quiet understanding that few leaders said aloud. Whoever stood at Thermopylae would face the first impact of the Persian invasion. They would be the shield protecting the rest of Greece. And shields, in war, are often broken before the battle ends. The Spartans understood this reality better than anyone. Their entire culture had been built around the idea that a warrior's duty was to hold the line, regardless of the odds. And so, when the Greek alliance began discussing who would lead the defense of Thermopylae, the answer slowly became clear. The task would fall to Sparta. King Leonidas, now a seasoned warrior and respected leader, accepted the responsibility. But even this decision was complicated by something deeply rooted in Spartan tradition. At the very moment Greece needed Sparta's full military strength, the city was in the middle of a sacred religious festival known as the Carneia. During the Carneia, Spartan law forbade the full army from marching to war. Religious observance took precedence over military action, even during moments of crisis. To modern minds, this may seem impossible to understand. Yet to the Spartans, the laws of the gods were as binding as the laws of men. Leonidas therefore faced a difficult compromise. He could not take the entire Spartan army north to Thermopylae. Instead, he would lead a smaller advance force, while the rest of Sparta prepared to follow later. From among the elite Spartan warriors known as the Spartiots, Leonidas selected 300 men. These were not random soldiers. Each was a fully trained Spartan citizen warrior. Each had already proven himself in battle. And, according to tradition, each had a living son who could carry on his family line. The reasoning was both practical and symbolic. If these men were to fall in battle, their families would not vanish from Spartan society. Yet another misunderstanding of history must be gently corrected here. The famous 300 Spartans did not stand alone. As Leonidas marched north, other Greek allies joined him along the way. By the time the force reached Thermopylae, roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers from various city-states had gathered to defend the pass. Yet the core of the defense remained unmistakably Spartan. At the center of the line stood Leonidas and his 300 warriors, men trained from childhood to stand shoulder to shoulder without fear. Ancient stories tell us that before Leonidas departed Sparta, his wife Gorgo asked him a question that must have lingered quietly in the air of their home. "If you do not return," she asked, "what should I do?" Leonidas's answer has echoed through history with the calm simplicity of Spartan culture. "Marry a good man," he told her, "and bear strong children." The words were not dramatic, nor were they spoken with theatrical sorrow. They reflected something deeper within the Spartan mindset. Leonidas understood the risk he was accepting. Standing at Thermopylae meant facing the full weight of the Persian Empire. It meant confronting a force that had already shaken the entire Greek world with its sheer scale. Yet in the quiet certainty of Spartan belief, the value of holding the line outweighed the fear of dying while doing so. And so the king and his warriors began their journey northward toward the narrow gateway of Thermopylae. Behind them lay the cities, farms, and families of Greece. Ahead of them waited the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. The storm from the east was coming, and Leonidas intended to meet it at the gates. 3 days. That was all it would take for a small band of warriors standing in a narrow mountain pass to become one of the most enduring legends in human history. 3 days at Thermopylae, where the mountains of Greece pressed close to the sea and the fate of entire civilizations seemed to hang quietly in the balance. Yet when the armies first arrived, battle did not begin immediately. Xerxes, king of the Persian Empire, looked down upon the defenders from his commanding vantage point and could hardly believe what he saw. Before him stood only a few thousand Greek soldiers, their bronze shields glinting in the sunlight, blocking a passage that his vast army could have surrounded an open terrain. To the Persian king, the situation seemed almost absurd. Surely these men would flee once they realized the scale of the force approaching them. And so Xerxes waited. For 4 days the Persian army camped near Thermopylae, its tents stretching across the plains while scouts observed the defenders at the narrow pass. Perhaps Xerxes believed the Greeks would lose their courage and retreat. Perhaps he wished to give them time to surrender and avoid unnecessary losses. Whatever his reasoning, those days passed in uneasy silence as 2 very different worlds stared at one another across the narrow gateway of the Hot Gates. Finally, Xerxes sent a messenger forward with a simple demand: lay down your weapons and surrender. The Persian Empire, after all, had absorbed dozens of kingdoms and nations far greater than these scattered Greek city-states. Submission would be the sensible choice. Yet the answer that returned from the Greek line was astonishing in its simplicity. Leonidas, king of Sparta, responded with 2 words that would echo through history: molon labe, come and take them. It was not a boast shouted in anger, it was simply a statement of quiet defiance, spoken by a man who had already accepted the path before him. And so the waiting ended. Xerxes ordered the first wave of his army to advance. The soldiers chosen for the opening assault came largely from the Median and Sicyan contingents, experienced troops who had fought across many regions of the Persian Empire. They moved confidently toward the narrow pass, expecting their superior numbers to overwhelm the defenders. But as they entered the tight corridor of Thermopylae, something remarkable happened. The geography of the land began to erase the advantage of numbers. The Greek defenders stood arranged in one of the most disciplined formations of ancient Greek warfare, the Spartan phalanx. Imagine, if you will, a wall made not of stone, but of living men. Bronze shields pressed tightly together, forming a continuous barrier of metal. Behind each shield stood a heavily armored hoplite warrior, gripping a spear nearly 8 feet long. The line moved as one body, each soldier protecting the man beside him while presenting a forest of spear points to the enemy. The Persian infantry rushed forward, but the narrowness of the pass prevented them from surrounding the Greeks. Only a small number of attackers could reach the front line at any moment. The Persian soldiers struck the wall of shields again and again, but the phalanx held firm. Spears thrust forward, shields pushed back, men fell. Another line of attackers stepped over them and tried again. Yet the result remained the same. The Greek defenders did not break. Leonidas, king of Sparta, responded with calm precision. The Spartan warriors and their Greek allies rotated positions, allowing those who had fought longest to withdraw briefly and recover, while fresh fighters stepped forward. The system was efficient, disciplined, and devastating in its simplicity. Hour after hour, the waves of Persian soldiers surged into the pass, and hour after hour they were driven back. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the ground before the Greek line had become littered with the bodies of fallen attackers. Yet the defenders remained standing, their bronze shields still locked together, their spears still poised for the next assault. The first day of the Battle of Thermopylae had ended,
and for the greatest empire the world had ever seen, not a single step forward had been gained.
As the sun faded beyond the mountains on that first day at Thermopylae, the Persian camp grew restless. What had begun as a seemingly simple military engagement had turned into something deeply unsettling for the commanders of the Persian Empire. The soldiers of Media and the Scythians had attacked again and again, yet the narrow pass remained closed. From the slopes above the battlefield, Xerxes had watched the fighting unfold hour after hour, his vast army colliding with a line of bronze shields that refused to move. The Persian king had commanded armies across a continent. Cities had surrendered at the mere mention of his name. Yet here, in a narrow corridor of rock and sea, a few thousand Greeks had defied him openly. The sight was difficult to accept. And so, as night settled over Thermopylae, Xerxes prepared to deploy a force he believed would surely break the stalemate. Within the Persian army existed an elite unit unlike any other, the Immortals. This was the personal guard of the Persian king, a corps of 10,000 carefully selected warriors known for their discipline, loyalty, and effectiveness in battle. The name Immortals did not suggest that these soldiers could not die. Rather, it came from the curious system that maintained their number. Whenever one soldier fell or was wounded, another immediately replaced him, ensuring the unit always remained exactly 10,000 strong. To observers unfamiliar with this practice, it appeared as though the unit never diminished, as if the same warriors simply could not be killed. Now Xerxes ordered these elite troops forward. If ordinary soldiers could not break the line, surely the Immortals would succeed. The next morning, the Persian army advanced once more into the narrow gateway of Thermopylae. At the front of the assault marched the Immortals, their equipment lighter and more flexible than the heavy armor of the Greek hoplites. In open terrain, this mobility often proved deadly. Persian soldiers could move quickly, strike from multiple angles, and overwhelm enemies with speed and arrows. But Thermopylae was not open terrain. The pass remained brutally narrow, and once again the Persian numbers became a burden rather than an advantage. The Immortals surged forward with confidence, expecting their reputation and skill to carry the day. Instead, they encountered the same silent wall that had stopped the previous assaults. The Spartan phalanx stood ready, shields interlocked and spears extended like a forest of iron. In the confined space of the pass, the longer Greek spears reached their targets before the shorter Persian weapons could strike back. The heavy bronze shields of the Greek hoplites absorbed blows that would have crippled lighter soldiers. Every movement of the phalanx was deliberate, controlled, and devastatingly effective. When one Spartan fell back from exhaustion, another stepped forward instantly, maintaining the unbroken line. The battle became a brutal contest of endurance. Persian warriors pushed forward again and again, yet the Greeks forced them back step by step. Ancient accounts tell us that Xerxes watched the fighting from a throne placed on the hillside overlooking the battlefield. From there, he could see the endless waves of soldiers moving into the narrow corridor, and the same grim outcome repeating itself each time. According to Herodotus, the Persian king leapt from his seat in alarm several times as he witnessed his elite soldiers thrown back by the defenders. Whether the story is entirely literal or partly dramatic, it reflects the shock the Persians experienced during that first day of serious combat. The Immortals, the pride of the Persian Empire, had failed to break the line. By the time evening approached once more, the battlefield before the Greek defenders was thick with fallen soldiers. The Immortals withdrew, their numbers replenished, but their momentum broken. For the second time in 2 days, the army of Xerxes had been stopped. The narrow gateway of Thermopylae remained closed. Yet, as the exhausted soldiers on both sides withdrew to their camps beneath the fading light, a quiet and dangerous truth was beginning to emerge. The Greeks had found a way to resist the Persian army in open battle. But somewhere beyond the cliffs and forests that surrounded the pass, there existed another pass through the mountains, a path that few people knew. And before the next sunrise arrived, someone would decide to reveal it. The second day at Thermopylae began much like the first. Dawn rose slowly over the cliffs of the Malian Gulf, casting long, pale light across the narrow pass where the Greek defenders once again prepared themselves for battle. The bronze shields of the hoplites gleamed faintly in the early sun, and the disciplined line of the Spartan phalanx formed once more across the gateway between mountain and sea. On the Persian side of the field, the vast army of Xerxes gathered again for another assault. The previous day had been humiliating, but the king of Persia commanded a force so large that defeat in a single engagement meant little. If the Greeks could hold the pass for one day, perhaps two, surely they could not resist forever. And so the attacks resumed. Persian soldiers advanced into the narrow corridor, drums beating in steady rhythm, banners snapping softly in the coastal wind. Yet once again, the geography of Thermopylae betrayed them. The same brutal mathematics of the battlefield repeated itself. Too many soldiers, too little space. The phalanx held firm, and the waves of Persian attackers crashed against it like water striking stone. Spears thrust forward, shields locked together, and the defenders of Greece pushed the attackers back again and again. By the afternoon of the second day, the battlefield looked disturbingly similar to the one before it. The ground between the armies had become littered with broken shields, fallen spears, and the silent forms of men who would never rise again. Xerxes continued to send wave after wave of troops forward, hoping sheer persistence might eventually break the defenders. But the narrow pass gave Leonidas and his allies the advantage they needed. It allowed a small, disciplined force to resist an army many times its size. From the Persian camp, the king watched the repeated failures with growing frustration. The Greek defenders were not merely stubborn, they were organized, patient, and frighteningly efficient in the art of ancient warfare. As evening approached, and the second day of battle slowly came to an end, it seemed possible that the stalemate might continue indefinitely. But history often turns not on great armies or heroic battles, but on the quiet decisions of individuals whose names might otherwise have been forgotten. That night, a man approached the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes. He was a local Greek from the region surrounding Thermopylae, a man who knew the mountains and forests better than most soldiers in either army. Under ordinary circumstances, his presence might have meant nothing, but Ephialtes carried with him a piece of knowledge that could change everything. He revealed to Xerxes the existence of a hidden route through the mountains behind the Greek position. It was known as the Oenopeia Path, a narrow trail that wound through wooded hills and eventually descended behind the defenders at Thermopylae. The pass that Leonidas had chosen so carefully could block a massive army from advancing directly forward, but it could not protect against an enemy approaching from behind. Xerxes immediately understood the significance of this information. If the Persian army could reach the Greek rear, the defenders would be trapped between two forces with nowhere to escape. The stalemate would end instantly. Without hesitation, the Persian king ordered a night march. A chosen force, once again including the immortals, began to move silently through the mountains guided by Ephialtes. The night was dark beneath the thick canopy of oak trees, and the soldiers advanced carefully along the winding trail of the Oenopeia Path. Leaves rustled softly under their sandals as the column climbed higher into the hills above the pass. Yet they were not completely unseen. The Greeks had placed a small guard force along the path to watch for exactly such a possibility. These soldiers came from the city of Phocis, tasked with protecting the secret route through the mountains. As the Persian column approached, the Phocian guards heard the faint sound of movement in the forest, the quiet crack of branches, the distant shuffle of many feet. Suddenly realizing that an enemy force was approaching, the Phocians rushed to defend the path. But confusion spread quickly in the darkness. The Persian immortals launched a sudden attack, and instead of holding their ground, the Phocian defenders withdrew toward the higher slopes of the mountain. Their retreat opened the pass completely.
And far below, at the narrow gateway of Thermopylae, Leonidas and his men continued to hold the pass, unaware that the shape of the battle had already begun to change. As the night passed and the first pale light of dawn approached the mountains, a messenger finally reached the Spartan king with devastating news. The Persian army was no longer only in front of them, it was also behind them.
The news arrived just before sunrise on the third day at Thermopylae. The air was cool and heavy with the quiet tension that often comes before battle. Leonidas listened carefully as the messenger delivered the report. A Persian force had marched through the mountains during the night. They had taken the Thermopylae path. Within hours, they would descend behind the Greek line. For the defenders of the pass, the meaning was unmistakable. The narrow gateway that had protected them for 2 days had now become a trap. The Persian army would soon surround them from both sides. Leonidas did not panic. Ancient sources suggest that he had long suspected such a possibility. Thermopylae was a brilliant defensive position, but no natural defense was perfect. There were always hidden paths, forgotten trails, ways around even the strongest walls. The Spartan king gathered the Greek commanders for a final council. The decision before them was stark and unavoidable. If they remained where they were, they would soon be encircled by the full force of Xerxes' army. Escape would become impossible. The entire Greek force could be annihilated in the narrow pass. Yet if they withdrew immediately, the Persians would advance unopposed into central Greece. The road to Athens would lie open. In that quiet moment before dawn, Leonidas made a choice that would echo through history. He ordered most of the Greek allied forces to withdraw. The men from Corinth, Phlius, and other cities were told to leave the pass while there was still time. They could retreat south and warn the rest of Greece that the Persian army had broken through. But not everyone chose to go. 700 soldiers from the city of Thespi refused to abandon the position. Their commander, Demophilus, declared that they would remain with the Spartans. 400 men from Thebes also stayed, though historians still debate whether they remained willingly or under obligation. At the center of the defenders, however, stood the 300 Spartan warriors who had marched north with Leonidas. They did not consider leaving. For Spartans, retreat in battle was more than shameful, it was unthinkable. Spartan law and culture demanded absolute commitment to the battlefield. A Spartan warrior returned home either with his shield or upon it. There was no honorable third option. Yet the decision may have carried deeper meaning than mere obedience to tradition. Some ancient accounts speak of an oracle delivered before the campaign began. According to this prophecy, either Sparta itself would fall to the Persians, or a king of Sparta must die. Leonidas may have believed that his own sacrifice would fulfill the oracle and preserve his city. Whether prophecy truly guided his decision, or whether it simply strengthened his resolve, the result was the same. Leonidas prepared to fight to the end. The morning of the third day dawned slowly over Thermopylae. The remaining defenders stood ready in the narrow pass, aware that the final battle was approaching. Behind them, somewhere in the mountains, the Persian detachment continued its descent along the Thermopylae path. Soon the two halves of Xerxes' army would close together like the jaws of a trap. Yet the Greeks did not collapse in despair. Instead, they prepared themselves calmly. Ancient writers describe how the Spartans combed their hair that morning before battle, a ritual act that symbolized readiness for death. It was said that when Xerxes learned of this strange behavior, he asked why the Spartans would take time to groom themselves when they were about to face annihilation. The answer, according to the Spartan exile Demaratus, was simple. Spartans prepared their hair when they intended to risk their lives. As the sun rose higher above the cliffs, Leonidas addressed the men who remained with him. His words were not long, and history has preserved only fragments of what he might have said, but one phrase endured through centuries of retelling. "Eat well today, men," the Spartan king told them quietly, "for tonight we dine in hell." The soldiers laughed softly at the grim humor. They understood what awaited them. They understood that the Thermopylae sacrifice was no longer about victory. It was about time. Every moment they held the pass allowed the rest of Greece to prepare for the storm that was coming. And so the 300 Spartans, together with their Thespian allies and the remaining Thebans, stood in the narrow gateway between mountain and sea. The army of Xerxes approached from the front. Another force moved silently through the mountains behind them. The final battle of Leonidas had begun. The third day at Thermopylae did not begin like the days before it. For 2 days, the narrow gateway between mountain and sea had been a wall, a place where bronze shields and disciplined formations turned back wave after wave of the Persian Empire. But as the morning light crept slowly across the rocks and the quiet waters of the Malian Gulf, something changed in the air. The defenders understood what was coming. News of the Persian force marching through the mountains had already reached Leonidas during the night. Soon the soldiers of Xerxes would appear behind them. The pass that had once protected them would become a cage. And so Leonidas made a decision that surprised even some of his allies. Instead of waiting behind the defensive line, instead of allowing the Persian army to close in from both directions, the Spartan king chose to attack. As the sun climbed higher above Thermopylae, the remaining defenders stepped forward beyond the narrowest part of the pass and into the wider ground where the Persian army had been gathering. It was a dangerous choice, perhaps even reckless. In open terrain, the Persian numbers could finally surround them. Yet Leonidas understood something fundamental about the situation. The battle was no longer about survival, it was about time. Every moment they fought would delay the advance of the Persian Empire into the heart of Greece. Every Persian soldier who fell here would not be fighting later in the wars to come. The last stand at Thermopylae had begun. When the Spartan charge erupted, it was sudden and ferocious. The defenders surged forward as a single mass of bronze shields and spears, driving directly into the Persian formations waiting ahead of them. Persian soldiers had expected another day of slow, grinding attacks against the defensive line. Instead, they found themselves facing warriors who were no longer holding the pass, but rushing outward to meet them. The clash that followed was far more chaotic than the battles of the previous days. The order of the phalanx began to break apart as the fighting spread across the wider ground. Spears thrust forward again and again until shafts splintered under the pressure of impact. When a spear broke, a Spartan warrior drew his short sword and continued fighting. When swords shattered or were lost, men struck with shields, fists, and whatever weapons remained in their hands. Herodotus would later write that during this phase of the Spartan combat, the fighting became almost primal. Warriors grappled with enemies at arm's length, pushing and striking in the dust and blood of the battlefield. The discipline that had defined the earlier defense now blended with a raw determination to inflict as much damage as possible before the inevitable end arrived. Leonidas himself fought at the front of the charge. Spartan kings did not command from distant hillsides or raised thrones. They fought among their warriors. Somewhere in the chaos of the expanding battle, the moment came when Leonidas fell. Ancient accounts do not record exactly how the Spartan king died. Perhaps he was struck by a spear or arrow, perhaps overwhelmed by multiple attackers as the Persian numbers closed in. But when the news spread through the defenders that Leonidas had been killed, the battle did not end. Instead, it intensified. Around the fallen body of the Spartan king, a desperate struggle erupted. Persian soldiers recognized the significance of the moment. Capturing the body of Leonidas would be a powerful symbol for Xerxes, proof that the defiant Spartan king had been destroyed. They rushed forward again and again, attempting to seize the corpse. Yet each attempt met fierce resistance. The Spartan warriors and their Thespian allies formed a tight circle around the fallen king, refusing to allow the Persians to take him.
Herodotus recounts that the Persians tried 4 separate times to capture Leonidas's body. 4 times they were driven back. Each attempt turned the ground around the fallen king into a savage whirl of spears and shields. Eventually, the defenders succeeded in pulling the body of Leonidas back from the front line, carrying him toward the rear of their shrinking position. But by then, the battle had already reached a point from which there could be no return. The Persian army continued to pour forward from the plain, and somewhere beyond the mountains behind them, another Persian force was descending toward the battlefield.
The battle did not end when Leonidas fell. If anything, the death of the Spartan king only hardened the resolve of the warriors still standing around him. The defenders of Thermopylae understood that the battle had already passed the point where victory was possible. What remained now was something different, something quieter, almost inevitable. They would hold as long as they could, not to win the war, but to leave behind a story that would echo far beyond the narrow pass where they now fought. The Persian army continued to press forward from the open plain, while at the same time, the detachment that had marched through the mountains along the Thermopylae path began descending behind the Greek position. Slowly, like the closing jaws of a trap, the 2 halves of Xerxes' army approached one another. The remaining defenders of Greece had only one option left. They withdrew from the widening battlefield and moved toward a small rise of land near the entrance of the pass, a place known in ancient accounts as the Hill of Colonus. It was not large, not imposing, not the kind of ground that would normally be remembered in history. Yet for the warriors gathered there on the 3rd day of the Battle of Thermopylae, it became the final stage of their resistance. The Spartan warriors and their Thespian allies climbed the low hill, forming a defensive circle around the body of their fallen king. Their shields were dented, their spears broken, their armor streaked with dust and blood from hours of relentless combat. Yet the calm discipline of Sparta remained. They stood together in silence, watching the Persian army surround them from every direction. Not all of the Greek defenders remained with them. The Theban contingent, realizing that the battle was truly lost, chose a different path. As the Persian forces approached the hill, the Thebans stepped forward with raised hands, signaling their surrender. They hoped that submission would spare their lives. Xerxes' soldiers accepted their surrender, but mercy was not entirely granted. Ancient sources record that the Persian commanders marked the Thebans with the brand of a hot iron on their foreheads, a humiliating symbol meant to remind them that they had fought against the great king. The remaining warriors on the hill did not surrender. The Spartans and the Thespians had already made their choice. They understood that there would be no return home from this place. Around them, the Persian army closed in. Thousands of soldiers surrounded the small hill, a vast ring of spears, shields, and banners tightening around a handful of exhausted defenders. By this point, many of the Greek warriors had lost their primary weapons. Spears had snapped under the pressure of repeated fighting. Swords had dulled or broken against armor and bone. Some men still carried fragments of shields or daggers. Others stood with nothing but their fists. Yet they remained standing. The final moments of the Thermopylae last stand unfolded beneath a sky that was beginning to darken with the dust and smoke of the battlefield. Xerxes, watching from a distance, had little interest in sacrificing more of his army in a direct assault. Too many soldiers had already fallen in the narrow pass during the previous days. Instead, he chose a method that required no courage from his troops and no risk to his remaining forces. The Persian king ordered his archers forward. The command passed quickly through the ranks. Lines of Persian bowmen stepped into position around the hill of Colonus. Thousands of arrows were prepared. In silence, the defenders watched as the archers lifted their bows toward the sky. And then the arrows were released. Ancient writers later described the moment in simple, haunting language. The sky above Thermopylae darkened as thousands of arrows rose into the air at once.
For a brief instant, the sunlight vanished behind the storm of black shapes. Then the arrows began to fall. They struck the hill in a relentless rain. Bronze shields lifted instinctively to protect those beneath them, but there were too many arrows, too many directions, too little shelter. One by one, the final defenders fell where they stood. Spartan warriors, Thespian warriors, men whose names would never be recorded in history. Yet none of them fled. None of them abandoned the hill. When the rain of arrows ended and the Persian soldiers cautiously approached the silent mound of bodies, the Battle of Thermopylae was over. The pass had finally been opened. But the story of the Spartans who died there was only beginning.
When the arrows finally stopped falling over the hill of Colonus, an eerie stillness settled across the battlefield of Thermopylae. The dust that had filled the air during the fighting drifted slowly downward, and the sounds of combat faded into distant murmurs among the Persian ranks. What had once been a narrow corridor of defiance was now quiet. The final defenders of the pass lay where they had fallen, scattered across the slope that had become the last ground of the Spartan warriors and their allies. Persian soldiers approached cautiously at first. They had learned during the previous days that even wounded Greek warriors could remain dangerous. But now there was no movement. The resistance had ended. The Battle of Thermopylae was over. Yet victory did not feel entirely triumphant within the Persian camp. For 3 days, the army of Xerxes, the greatest military force the ancient world had yet assembled, had been delayed by a comparatively tiny group of defenders. The great king had expected this campaign to resemble a procession across Greece, a demonstration of imperial power so overwhelming that resistance would crumble quickly. Instead, he had encountered something unexpected, a handful of warriors who would refuse to retreat even when defeat was certain. Among the fallen on the hill of Colonus lay the body of Leonidas, the Spartan king whose decision to remain at Thermopylae had shaped the entire battle. Persian soldiers soon located the corpse among the dead. Word spread quickly through the ranks and eventually reached Xerxes himself. The king of Persia came to see the fallen enemy whose stubborn resistance had forced his empire to pay such a heavy price. Ancient historians describe Xerxes walking through the aftermath of the battlefield, surrounded by guards and officers as he examined the remains of the battle. What he felt in that moment is impossible to know with certainty. Perhaps there was anger, perhaps humiliation, perhaps even a reluctant admiration for the courage of an enemy who had fought so fiercely. But whatever thoughts passed through his mind, the order that followed shocked many observers in the ancient world. Xerxes commanded that the body of Leonidas be desecrated. The Spartan king was beheaded, and his severed head was placed upon a stake. In many ancient cultures, such treatment of a fallen enemy might not have been unusual, but among the Persians, such actions were considered deeply dishonorable. Persian tradition often emphasized respect for brave opponents, even in defeat. Soldiers who fought with courage were sometimes granted burial or returned to their people after battle. The punishment inflicted upon Leonidas therefore stood out even to ancient writers as an act driven not by custom, but by rage. The humiliation of being delayed for 3 days by such a small force had clearly wounded Xerxes' pride. The Persian king had crossed the Hellespont with an army drawn from every corner of his vast empire. His engineers had built bridges across the sea itself. His soldiers had marched across continents. And yet, at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, his advance had been halted by a handful of Spartan warriors and their allies. The desecration of Leonidas's body was, in many ways, Xerxes' attempt to reclaim the authority that had been challenged during those 3 days of resistance. With Thermopylae finally broken, the Persian army continued its advance south into Greece. City after city fell before the approaching empire. Eventually, Xerxes reached Athens, the city that had once humiliated his father Darius at the Battle of Marathon.
The Athenians had already evacuated their population, fleeing to the nearby island of Salamis and other safe locations. When the Persians entered the empty city, they burned it. The temples of the Acropolis were destroyed, sacred buildings reduced to blackened stone and ash. For Xerxes, it must have seemed like vengeance fulfilled at last. The insult delivered to Persia a decade earlier had now been answered with fire. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent victory, something far more dangerous had begun to unfold. Thermopylae had not stopped the Persian invasion entirely, but it had slowed it, and that delay had given the Greeks something far more valuable than territory or buildings. It had given them time. While Leonidas and his warriors made their final stand at Thermopylae, events were already unfolding elsewhere that would shape the future of the war. Far to the south, the city of Athens faced a decision that few civilizations in history have ever been forced to confront. The Persian army was advancing. The defeat at Thermopylae meant that nothing now stood between Xerxes and the heart of Greece. The Athenians understood that their city could not survive a direct assault from the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, and so they did something remarkable. They abandoned their own city. Families gathered what possessions they could carry. Ships arrived along the harbors of Attica. One by one, the citizens of Athens boarded vessels and sailed away, seeking refuge on nearby islands and coastal towns. It was not an act of surrender. It was preparation. The Athenian leader Themistocles had already begun shaping a different kind of defense, one that did not rely on stone walls or narrow mountain passes. Instead, it relied on ships. Athens possessed one of the most powerful navies in the Greek world, a fleet of swift triremes designed for maneuverability and speed. While the Persian army marched through mainland Greece, the Greek fleet gathered near the island of Salamis, just west of Athens. Themistocles understood something important about the Persian Empire. Xerxes commanded an enormous navy, drawing from many different regions of his vast territory. Phoenician sailors, Egyptian crews, Ionian ships, and vessels from across the empire had joined the Persian fleet. In open waters, that immense fleet would be terrifying. But the waters around Salamis were not open, they were narrow. Twisting channels between island and mainland limited the movement of large numbers of ships. It was the naval equivalent of Thermopylae. Themistocles needed the Persians to enter those waters. According to ancient accounts, he achieved this through a mixture of strategy and deception. Messages were sent that suggested the Greek fleet was divided and planning to retreat. Xerxes believed the opportunity was perfect. If the Persian navy attacked quickly, they might trap the Greek ships before they escaped. Confident in his overwhelming numbers, Xerxes ordered the fleet forward. The Battle of Salamis began as dawn broke across the strait. From the shore, Xerxes watched from a golden throne set upon the hillside, eager to witness what he expected would be the final destruction of Greek resistance. At first, the Persian fleet advanced confidently into the narrow channel. Hundreds of ships moved forward, oars cutting through the water as commanders shouted orders across the decks. But as the fleet entered deeper into the strait, the size that had once been its greatest strength became its greatest weakness. The ships crowded together, oars collided, maneuvering became difficult. Meanwhile, the smaller Greek fleet moved with careful coordination through the narrow waters. Greek triremes surged forward, bronze rams smashing into the sides of Persian vessels. Ships splintered, oars shattered, sailors were thrown into the churning water between colliding hulls. What Xerxes witnessed from the shore was not the victory he had expected. Instead, the massive Persian fleet became trapped within its own numbers. Ship after ship crashed into another. Greek vessels darted through the chaos, striking and retreating before the Persians could respond effectively. The battle lasted for hours, but its outcome slowly became clear. By the end of the day, the Persian navy had suffered catastrophic losses. Dozens of ships were destroyed. Many more were captured or forced to flee. The Greek fleet remained intact. The Battle of Salamis had ended in a decisive Greek victory. For Xerxes, the consequences were immediate. Without naval superiority, his army in Greece was dangerously exposed. Supply lines across the Aegean Sea could no longer be guaranteed. Reluctantly, the Persian king decided to withdraw the majority of his forces back toward Asia. He left behind a powerful army under the command of his general Mardonius, intending to continue the campaign the following year. But the momentum of the war had changed forever. Thermopylae had delayed the Persian advance. Salamis had broken its naval power. The war that had once seemed impossible to win now looked very different. And somewhere in the memory of those who had fought at Thermopylae, the sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans was no longer just a tragedy. It had become the moment that gave Greece the time it needed to survive.
The story that most people remember ends at Thermopylae. The shields broken, the hill of Colonus silent beneath a sky darkened by arrows. The 300 Spartans lying beside their allies where they had fallen. For many audiences, especially those shaped by modern films, that moment feels like the end of the story, a tragic final stand against overwhelming odds. But history rarely ends where legend chooses to stop. In truth, the death of Leonidas was not the conclusion of the war. It was the spark that ignited its final and most violent chapter. 1 year passed after the Battle of Thermopylae. The Persian king Xerxes had returned to Asia after the disaster of the Battle of Salamis, leaving behind a powerful army in Greece under the command of his general Mardonius. Mardonius was not merely a subordinate commander. He was a skilled strategist, a trusted relative of the Persian royal family, and a man determined to finish what the invasion had begun. The Persian army he commanded was still enormous by ancient standards. Ancient historians suggest that nearly 300,000 soldiers remained under his control, drawn from the vast resources of the Persian Empire. These forces occupied much of northern and central Greece. Cities that had resisted before were threatened again. Those that had submitted to Persia watched carefully, waiting to see which side would ultimately prevail. Across Greece, the memory of Thermopylae lingered like a shadow. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his warriors had not been forgotten. If anything, it had hardened the resolve of the Greek states that had chosen resistance over submission. Sparta, in particular, could not ignore the unfinished war. The Spartan system had always been slow to mobilize its full strength. Philogist festivals, political deliberation, and the careful structure of Spartan society meant that armies did not march impulsively. But now the moment had come. In the summer of 479 BCE, Sparta finally committed the full weight of its military power to the war. This was no longer a small expedition like the one Leonidas had led to Thermopylae. This time, the Spartans marched with an army that reflected the true scale of their warrior society. 5,000 Spartiates, the elite full citizens of Sparta trained for war since childhood, assembled for the campaign. Behind them marched tens of thousands of allied Greek soldiers, drawn from cities that had joined the resistance against Persia. Together, the army numbered perhaps 40,000 hoplites and many more lightly armed troops who supported them. The command of this force did not fall to Leonidas, whose bones still lay somewhere in the northern soil of Greece. Instead, leadership passed to Pausanias, the young Spartan general who was also the nephew of the fallen king. Pausanias carried not only the responsibility of command, but also the memory of his uncle's death at Thermopylae. Across the plains of Boeotia, the armies of Greece and Persia slowly moved toward one another. The final confrontation would take place near the city of Plataea, a modest settlement south of Thebes. For days, the two forces observed each other across the rolling ground. Scouts moved through the hills, supply lines shifted. Neither side rushed blindly into battle. Mardonius understood the power of the Greek hoplite phalanx and sought to draw the enemy away from advantageous ground. Pausanias, equally cautious, maintained the Greek army on higher terrain,
where the Persian cavalry would struggle to operate effectively. The tension stretched across days of maneuver and watchfulness. Soldiers on both sides knew that when the battle finally came, it would decide the fate of the Persian wars. And then, through a mixture of miscommunication and tactical movement, the situation suddenly changed. During a night maneuver, the Greek army shifted position, intending to reorganize its lines and secure access to fresh water sources. From a distance, the movement looked chaotic. Units appeared to be withdrawing from their positions. To Persian observers, it seemed that the Greek army had lost cohesion. Mardonius saw an opportunity. Believing that the Greeks were retreating in disorder, he ordered an immediate attack. Persian cavalry surged forward across the plain toward the shifting Greek lines. Dust rose beneath the hooves of horses as the Persian advance accelerated. From Mardonius's perspective, the moment of victory had finally arrived. The enemy seemed to be breaking. But what he did not yet understand was that the Spartan army had not collapsed. It had simply turned.
For a brief moment on the plains of Plataea, the Persian cavalry believed they were chasing a broken army. Dust swirled across the dry fields as the riders advanced, confident that the Greeks were retreating in disorder. From a distance, the shifting formations of hoplites looked scattered, their lines uneven, their movement uncertain. But appearances on a battlefield can be dangerously misleading. The Greek soldiers were not fleeing, they were repositioning. And when the Persian cavalry finally came within striking distance, the illusion vanished. The Spartan soldiers halted, shields lifted, spears lowered. The phalanx closed. It happened with a precision that had been forged through generations of Spartan discipline. Bronze shields overlapped until they formed a continuous wall. Behind that wall, rows of spears angled forward like the bristles of some immense iron creature waiting to strike. The cavalry of the Persian Empire suddenly faced the same terrible formation that had once held the narrow pass of Thermopylae. But this time, the Greeks were not defending a narrow corridor. This time, they were advancing. The clash that followed marked the true beginning of the Battle of Plataea. Persian cavalry attempted to harass the Spartan line, circling and launching missiles from horseback, but the heavy infantry formation proved difficult to penetrate. The Spartan warriors moved forward step by step, their shields locked, their formation tightening as they advanced across the plain. Dust rose beneath their sandals as thousands of bronze-clad soldiers marched together. From the perspective of the Persian army, it must have looked like a slow-moving wall of metal rolling across the battlefield. At the center of the Persian forces rode Mardonius himself. Unlike Xerxes, who had commanded from distant vantage points, Mardonius chose to fight close to the action. Ancient accounts describe him mounted on a magnificent white horse, wearing ornate armor that gleamed beneath the sun. Around him rode his personal guard, elite Persian soldiers determined to break the Spartan line before it could fully engage the rest of the Persian army. The moment of collision came suddenly. The Greek phalanx surged forward with tremendous force, shields slamming together as the front ranks drove their spears into the Persian infantry, attempting to form a defensive line. The Persian soldiers fought bravely, but they lacked the heavy armor and long spears that defined the Greek hoplite system. The impact of the Spartan charge was devastating. Spears thrust forward again and again, driving the Persian line backward step by step. In the chaos of the fighting, Mardonius himself was drawn into the center of the struggle. His presence on the battlefield inspired his soldiers to fight harder, but it also placed him in extraordinary danger. According to the historian Herodotus, the decisive moment came when a Spartan warrior named Ambience reached the Persian commander. Armed with a heavy weapon, Ambience struck Mardonius with a crushing blow to the head. The Persian general fell from his horse and died where he landed. The death of a commander in ancient warfare often meant more than the loss of a leader. Armies depended heavily on the authority and direction of their generals.
When Mardonius fell, confusion spread rapidly through the Persian ranks. Soldiers who had been pressing forward moments earlier suddenly found themselves uncertain about what orders to follow. The cohesion of the Persian army began to fracture. The Spartan phalanx did not hesitate. Seeing the enemy falter, the Greek soldiers pressed forward with renewed momentum. The disciplined formation that had turned the tide of so many battles now became an unstoppable force driving through the Persian lines. Across the battlefield, the collapse spread like a crack through ice. Persian soldiers began to withdraw. Then they began to run. What followed was not a controlled retreat, but a rout. Greek forces pursued the fleeing enemy across the plains of Plataea. Ancient historians would later write that the scale of the Persian defeat was staggering. Out of the massive army that had once marched into Greece, only a small fraction managed to escape the slaughter and return eastward. The Battle of Plataea had ended in overwhelming Greek victory, and with that victory, the dream of Persian domination over Greece was shattered forever.
When the Battle of Plataea ended and the dust of the battlefield slowly settled, the Persian invasion of Greece had effectively come to an end. The enormous army that had once crossed the Hellespont under Xerxes had been broken. Some soldiers fled back toward Asia. Others scattered across the countryside of Greece, never to return to their homes. For the Greek world, the victory at Plataea marked more than the end of a war. It marked the survival of an entire civilization. Cities that had stood on the edge of destruction now began the long process of rebuilding. Temples burned by the Persian army would eventually rise again. Walls would be reconstructed. Harbors would fill with ships once more. Yet even in the moment of victory, many Greeks remembered that the path to Plataea had begun somewhere far to the north, at a narrow pass between mountain and sea. Thermopylae had not been a victory in the traditional sense. The defenders there had been overwhelmed. The Spartan king Leonidas had died. The 300 Spartans who had marched with him never returned home. But the meaning of Thermopylae had grown larger with each passing year. In the decades that followed the Persian Wars, the story of Leonidas and his warriors became something more than a military episode. It became a symbol. Greek writers, poets, and historians returned again and again to the moment when a small group of soldiers had chosen to stand against an empire. They spoke not only of courage, but of calculation. Leonidas had not marched to Thermopylae expecting to win a battle. He had marched there to delay an invasion. Those 3 days at the narrow pass had bought Greece something priceless: time. Time for Athens to evacuate its population and prepare its fleet. Time for the Greek alliance to organize resistance. Time for the naval battle at Salamis to take place. Time for Sparta to mobilize the army that would eventually defeat Persia at Plataea. Without those 3 days, the story of Greece might have unfolded very differently. Yet the memory of Leonidas did not immediately become the grand legend we recognize today. In fact, decades passed before the Spartans themselves returned to recover the remains of their fallen king. According to historical accounts, roughly 40 years after the battle, the Spartans organized an expedition to bring Leonidas home. His bones were located near Thermopylae and carried back to Sparta with ceremonial honor. There, the Spartans constructed a shrine in his memory. Annual festivals were held to commemorate the king who had died, fulfilling the duty expected of every Spartan warrior. The legacy of Leonidas was not preserved only in Sparta. At Thermopylae itself, a monument was eventually erected. The inscription carved into the stone was simple, almost quiet in its dignity. It did not boast of victory or exaggerate the scale of the battle. Instead, it spoke directly to the traveler passing through the narrow pass centuries later. The words, attributed to the poet Simonides, read, "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws.
In those few lines, the entire philosophy of Sparta seemed to exist. Duty above survival, loyalty above fear, the willingness to place the needs of the city above the life of the individual. Over time, the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae spread far beyond Greece. Historians of later civilizations would study the battle as an example of how discipline and strategy could challenge overwhelming numbers. The idea that a small force could stand against a vast empire became one of the most enduring themes in military history. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of Leonidas was not the battle itself, but the message it carried. Thermopylae proved something that had once seemed impossible. The Persian Empire could be resisted. An army that appeared unstoppable could be slowed, delayed, and eventually defeated. And that realization changed the course of history.
And so the story of Leonidas slowly fades back into the quiet rhythm of history. Not with the triumphant sound of trumpets, not with the loud celebration of a conqueror returning home, but with something softer, something more enduring. The silence that follows a battlefield long after the armies have disappeared. If you could stand today at Thermopylae, the place where the famous stand once took place, the landscape might surprise you. The sea that once touched the narrow pass has slowly receded over the centuries. The ground has widened. The cliffs still rise, but the tight corridor that once forced two armies to collide has softened with time. Yet even as the geography changes, the memory remains anchored to that ground. Travelers who visit the Thermopylae Memorial today often describe a strange stillness in the air. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of memory. Somewhere in that quiet landscape, nearly 2,500 years ago, a small group of soldiers stood between their homeland and the largest empire the world had ever seen. They knew the numbers, they knew the odds, they knew almost certainly how the story would end, and still they stayed. That decision, simple and terrifying at the same time, is what turned the Battle of Thermopylae into something far larger than a military engagement. It became a story about choice. The choice to stand, the choice to endure, the choice to face something overwhelming without turning away. For centuries, historians have debated the strategic value of Leonidas' stand. Some argue that the delay was crucial. Others believe that the symbolic power of the resistance mattered even more than the military consequences. But perhaps the most important element of the Leonidas legacy lies somewhere deeper than strategy or politics. It lies in the quiet understanding that history is often shaped by moments when ordinary people decide that something is worth defending, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when survival is not guaranteed. Leonidas was not a mythical hero carved from marble. He was a king raised inside one of the most disciplined societies in the ancient world, a man shaped by laws that demanded courage, loyalty, and obedience. When he stood at Thermopylae, he did what every Spartan had been trained to do since childhood. He held the line. The inscription at the Thermopylae Memorial still captures that spirit with extraordinary simplicity. "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." Those words have echoed across centuries because they remind us that the past is not only a record of victories and defeats, it is also a record of human choices. And tonight, as the fire burns quietly somewhere in the background of this story, that ancient battlefield feels very far away. The clash of bronze shields has faded. The marching of armies has disappeared into the distance of time. What remains now is only the story itself. A king who stood in a narrow pass, 300 soldiers who did not turn back, and a moment in history when courage held its ground against an empire. If you are still awake, you can let that image slowly drift through your mind.
the mountains rising on one side, the sea stretching quietly on the other, the narrow road between them where history once paused for 3 long days. But you do not have to stand guard tonight. You do not have to hold the line. The battle is long over. The story has been told, and the world is quiet again. The fire continues to glow softly. The night air grows calm. History will still be here when morning comes, and I will be here as well, waiting to tell the next story when you return. For now, let the past settle gently into silence. Close your eyes if you wish, breathe slowly, and allow the long road of history to fade into rest. Good night.